The compass spun in my hand, the needle circling with a slow, deliberate motion that made my skin crawl. I'd seen compasses malfunction before, drop one too many times, get too close to a radio, and you might throw it off for a minute. But this was different. We were 3 miles deep in the Cascade Mountains, surrounded by endless pine, the ground soft with moss and the air thick with October mist. There was no iron bed beneath us, no electromagnetic field, nothing but the ancient forest pressing in on all sides. And yet, the compass refused to settle, as if the very idea of north had been erased from the world. I tapped the glass, hoping for a simple fix, but the needle just kept turning, slow and stubborn. I glanced up at Sergeant Donnelly, who was frowning at his own compass, the lines around his eyes deepening with every second. He was the kind of man who didn't rattle easily. 20 years in the Army, more scars than I could count, and a reputation for keeping his head when everyone else lost theirs. If he was worried, I knew we were in trouble. The forest was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence you get on a calm morning, but a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed against your ears and made you feel like you were underwater. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just the sound of our boots on the damp earth and the faint, nervous breathing of 5 men who suddenly realized they were very much alone. It was supposed to be a routine exercise, advanced terrain navigation, command called it. Find your way out of the woods at night with nothing but a map, a compass, and your wits. Most teams finished without a hitch. Radio back to base, follow the markers, make it to the extraction point by dawn. But we'd drawn the short straw, the deepest, wildest part of the forest, the section the locals in Granite Falls warned us about. They said things didn't work right out here. We'd laughed it off, the way soldiers always do, until the warning started to feel less like superstition and more like prophecy. The mist had rolled in fast, swallowing the trees and turning the world into a shifting sea of gray. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, maybe less. The ground was slick, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and something else, something musky and sour, like fur left to rot. Every step felt like a trespass, every breath a risk. And then the radio started to fail. Static at first, then a burst of noise so sharp it made me flinch, then nothing at all. We were cut off, blind, and lost in a place that suddenly felt like it didn't want us there. I remember the moment it hit me, the realization that we weren't just lost, we were being watched. It was a feeling more than a fact, a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense that the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the mission, but the unease only grew. The others felt it too. Ramirez, usually the joker, had gone silent. Porter, the youngest, kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes wide and uncertain. Even Callahan, our by-the-book lieutenant, was starting to lose his edge. We pressed on, following the faint sound of running water, hoping it would lead us back to the main trail. But the deeper we went, the stranger things became. The mist thickened, swallowing our night vision goggles in halos of green light. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, until it felt like the forest itself was closing in around us. And then we found the tracks. They were pressed deep into the mud along the creek bank. Massive 5-toed prints, at least 18 inches long, with a wide heel and an arch that looked almost human. But no human foot was that big, and no human would walk barefoot this deep into the wilderness. The edges were sharp, the impressions fresh. Whatever made them had passed through recently, maybe while we were already out here stumbling through the mist. Donnelly knelt beside the tracks, his face pale in the green glow. "We're not alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, I knew he was right. Something was out there, moving through the trees, watching us from the shadows. Something that didn't want us to leave. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the mist swirling around us like a living thing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out while I still could. But there was nowhere to go, no north, no south, just endless trees and the knowledge that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. That was the moment the training exercise ended and the real nightmare began. The mission set up. We'd been dropped into the Cascade Mountains under the pretense of advanced terrain navigation. a phrase that sounded impressive on paper, but in reality meant command wanted to see if we could survive a night in the wild with little more than a map, a compass, and whatever grit we had left. The Army called it training. We called it a test of patience, endurance, and if you were unlucky, your sanity. Our unit, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, had been rotating through this exercise for weeks. Most teams came back with nothing more than a few scrapes, a story about getting turned around in the dark, and maybe a new appreciation for the comfort of a warm barracks. But our group, 6 men, each with their own scars and secrets, drew the short straw. We were assigned the deepest, most remote section of the forest, a place the locals in Granite Falls called the Dead Zone. They said compasses spun, radios died, and sometimes people just didn't come back. We'd heard the stories before we left base. Old-timers at the gas station, their faces weathered by years of mountain air, warned us with a seriousness that was hard to laugh off. "Things don't work right up there," one man said, his eyes never leaving mine. "You get turned around, you hear things, see things, best keep your wits about you." We'd all nodded, half smiling, pretending not to care. But the words stuck with me, echoing in the back of my mind as we loaded our gear and checked our equipment for the 3rd time. The team was a mix of experience and youth, each man chosen for his particular skill set. Sergeant Donnelly was our anchor, 43, built like a tank, with a reputation for keeping his cool when everyone else lost theirs. He'd seen more than his share of combat, and nothing seemed to shake him. If he was worried, you knew it was time to pay attention. Staff Sergeant Ramirez was the joker, always ready with a wisecrack or a story to break the tension. But beneath the humor was a sharp mind and a steady hand. He'd grown up in the desert, learned to track animals before he could ride a bike, and could read the land better than anyone I'd ever met. Lieutenant Callahan was the new guy, 29, fresh out of officer training, still clinging to the rulebook like it was a life raft. He was smart, ambitious, and determined to prove himself. But the forest didn't care about rank or ambition. Out here, experience mattered more than stripes. Private Porter was the youngest, just 22, eager to prove himself and desperate not to be the weak link. He carried his nervous energy like a badge, always glancing over his shoulder, always asking questions. Sometimes I envied his optimism. Most of the time, I worried it would get him killed. Then there was Carter, quiet, observant, the kind of guy who noticed things others missed. He'd grown up in rural Montana, tracking elk and bear through forests just like this one. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. And then there was me. I'd been in long enough to know that the Army's idea of adverse conditions usually meant something had gone wrong, or was about to. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to listen to the little voice that said, "Something's not right." That voice was screaming now. We set out from base camp just before dusk, the sky already heavy with clouds, the air sharp with the promise of rain. The forest swallowed us quickly, the trees closing in overhead, the ground soft and uneven beneath our boots. We moved in a tight column, Donnelly at the front, Callahan just behind him, then Ramirez, me, Porter, and Carter bringing up the rear. Our night vision goggles turned the world into a shifting landscape of green and black, every shadow a potential threat. The first hour passed in relative silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio and the soft crunch of boots on pine needles. We followed the map, checked our bearings, and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to settle over the group like a second skin. The deeper we went, the thicker the mist became, swirling around our legs and rising to our waists, then our chests, until it felt like we were wading through a living thing. It was Carter who first noticed the change. "Anyone else feel that?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The air. It's different." He was right. The temperature had dropped, the humidity rising until every breath felt heavy and damp. The forest, already quiet, seemed to grow even more silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. We pressed on, following the faint sound of running water, our only guide in a world that seemed to have lost all sense of direction. The creek was supposed to lead us back to the main trail, but the further we followed it, the more the landscape seemed to shift. Landmarks disappeared, familiar shapes twisted into something unrecognizable. The map became useless, the compass a cruel joke. That's when the equipment started to fail. First it was the radios, static, then a burst of noise, then nothing. Donnelly tried his backup, but it was the same. Callahan pulled out the GPS, but the screen flickered and died, refusing to power back on. Porter checked the batteries, but they were fresh, fully charged. It didn't matter. Nothing worked. We were alone, cut off from the world, lost in a place that felt increasingly hostile. The mist pressed closer, the silence deepened, and every step forward felt like a step into the unknown. I glanced at Donnelly, searching for reassurance, but his face was set, his eyes scanning the trees with a wariness I'd never seen before. "Stay sharp," he said quietly. "Eyes open, ears open. We stick together, no matter what." No one argued, no one joked. The forest had swallowed our bravado, left us with nothing but the cold, hard reality of our situation. We were 6 men, alone in the wild, with no way out and no idea what was waiting for us in the mist. And somewhere just beyond the edge of our vision, something was watching. Technology fails. It started with the compasses, but it didn't end there. In the Army, you learn to trust your gear, your boots, your rifle, your radio, your map. These are the things that keep you alive when everything else goes sideways. But in the Cascade Mountains that night, every piece of equipment we relied on seemed to turn against us one by one, as if the forest itself was stripping us of every advantage. I remember the moment it became real. Donnelly, always the steady hand, tapped his compass again, harder this time, as if he could force it to behave through sheer will. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle, and I could see the frustration in his jaw. "Ramirez, check yours," he said, his voice low and tight. Ramirez pulled his own compass from his vest, squinting at it in the green glow of his night vision goggles. "Same thing," he muttered. "It's spinning, like it's lost." Callahan, ever the officer, tried to take control. "Gentlemen, compasses malfunction. It happens. That's why we have GPS." He pulled out the handheld unit, the one command had issued to every team. He pressed the power button. The screen flickered, then went dark. He pressed it again, harder, as if force could fix what was broken. Nothing. "Battery must have died," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Porter, always eager, piped up, "Sir, we checked all batteries before insertion. Everything was fully charged." Callahan shot him a look, but there was no conviction behind it. We all knew what he was thinking. This wasn't normal. The radios were next. Donnelly lifted his handset, thumbed the button. "Bravo 2 to base. Do you copy?" Static. He tried again, voice a little louder, a little more urgent. "Bravo 2 to base. How copy?" More static, then a burst of noise, sharp, metallic, like metal scraping metal, then silence. Ramirez tried his own radio, but it was the same. The airwaves were dead or worse, jammed by something we couldn't see. It was as if the forest had decided we didn't belong and was methodically cutting every line that connected us to the outside world. The realization settled over us like a shroud. We were on our own, deep in a place that didn't want us there, with no way to call for help. The mist pressed closer, thickening until it felt like we were moving through a dream. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, then less. The trees became gray shadows, looming and indistinct. The ground softened under our boots, moss and undergrowth muffling every step. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just the faint crackle of static from the radios and the sound of 5 men breathing a little harder than they should. I tried to focus on the basics: map, compass, terrain. But the map was useless without a bearing, and the compasses were nothing but spinning glass. The terrain itself seemed to shift, familiar landmarks vanishing into the mist. The creek's sound echoing in ways that made it impossible to tell direction. Every instinct I had screamed that we were being watched, that we'd crossed some invisible line, and the forest was closing in around us. Donnelly tried to keep us moving. "We follow the creek," he said, pointing toward the faint sound of running water somewhere to our left. "Water flows downhill. If we follow it, we'll hit the main trail eventually." It was solid logic, the kind of old-school navigation that didn't rely on technology. We'd all been trained in it, but something about the way the mist clung to the trees, the way the silence pressed against my eardrums, made me doubt even that. We moved in a tight column, weapons at the ready, every sense straining for any sign of danger. The night vision goggles, usually so reliable, scattered the light, creating halos and false shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. Shadows moved where there should have been none. Every branch, every fallen log, seemed to shift and twist in the green glow. The air smelled wrong, not the clean scent of pine and earth I expected, but something heavier, musky, like wet fur left to rot. Porter whispered, "Anyone else smell that?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably a dead animal, deer maybe." Carter, always the tracker, shook his head. "Smells too strong for a deer, and too fresh." We reached the creek, the water rushing over rocks with a sound that should have been comforting, but instead felt too loud in the unnatural silence. Donnelly knelt by the edge, filling his canteen, eyes scanning the opposite bank. That's when I saw them, tracks. Not boot prints, not animal tracks. At least none I recognized. They were pressed deep into the soft mud, each one at least 18 inches long, 5 toes clearly defined, with a wide heel and an arch that looked almost human. But no human foot left prints that big, and no human walked this deep into the forest barefoot. "Sarge," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." Donnelly turned, saw where I was pointing, and went still. Ramirez moved up beside him, crouching low to get a better look. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over one of the prints, measuring its size. "Grizzly?" Porter suggested, but his voice cracked. Carter shook his head. "Wrong shape. Grizzlies don't walk upright. These are bipedal." Callahan tried to sound confident, but even he didn't believe it. "Could be fake. Hikers do that sometimes." Carter's reply was flat. "Hikers don't come this deep, and these are fresh, maybe an hour old. See how the edges haven't collapsed yet?" That meant whatever made them had passed through recently, while we were already out here stumbling through the mist. And if the tracks led along the creek, parallel to our intended route, that meant it might still be nearby. Ramirez stood, scanning the forest with his rifle raised. "We keep moving. Stay alert." Eyes out. We followed the creek for another 20 minutes, the mist growing thicker, the cold seeping through our gear. The tracks appeared again, then again. Always alongside us, never crossing our path, but close enough to let us know we weren't alone. The sense of isolation was complete. No working compasses, no GPS, no radio contact. The forest had swallowed us whole, and whatever was out there, whatever was leaving those tracks, wasn't finished with us yet. The descent into the unknown, the deeper we pushed into the forest, the more it felt like we were trespassing in a place that didn't want us. The mist thickened, swirling around our legs and rising to our chests, until it felt like we were wading through a living, breathing thing. Every step forward was a step into uncertainty, the world behind us swallowed by fog, the world ahead reduced to a few feet of shifting shadows and the faint, ever-present sound of the creek. The silence was the worst part. It was a silence that didn't just fill the air. It pressed in on your skull, made your thoughts echo, made your heartbeat sound like a drum. I'd spent nights in the woods before, but there was always something. The chirp of crickets, the distant call of an owl, the wind rustling through the branches. Here, there was nothing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We moved in a tight formation, every man hyper-aware, every sense straining for the slightest sign of danger. The night vision goggles, which usually gave us an edge, now seemed to betray us. The mist scattered the light, creating halos and false shapes that danced at the edge of our vision. Shadows flickered and shifted, and more than once I caught myself raising my rifle at nothing. My nerves stretched thin as wire. The ground was soft and treacherous, thick with moss and tangled roots that threatened to trip us with every step. The undergrowth was dense, ferns and devil's club brushing against our legs, soaking our gloves and uniforms. The cold was biting, seeping through our gear, numbing our fingers and making every movement feel sluggish and heavy. October in the Cascades was never forgiving, but this was something else, an unnatural chill that seemed to come from the ground itself. We followed the creek, our only guide in a world that had lost all sense of direction. The water rushed over rocks, dark and fast. Its sound both a comfort and a warning. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that hadn't been swallowed by the mist. But even the creek seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense, doubling back on itself, leading us deeper into the unknown. The tracks appeared again, pressed deep into the mud along the bank. Always fresh, always just ahead or just behind, never crossing our path but always there. A silent reminder that we were not alone. Carter, the tracker, studied them with a growing sense of unease. "They're following us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Or maybe we're following them." The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something musky and sour, like fur left to rot. It clung to us, seeped into our clothes, made every breath feel heavy. Porter, the youngest, kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes wet-eyed and uncertain. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" he asked, his voice trembling. No one answered, but we all felt it. The prickling at the back of the neck, the sense of eyes in the darkness. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees leaning in, the branches reaching out like fingers. Landmarks vanished, replaced by new shapes that made no sense. The map was useless, the compass a joke, the GPS a dead weight in Callahan's pack. We were navigating by instinct now, by the sound of the water, and the hope that it would lead us somewhere safe. Every so often we'd stop and listen, straining to hear anything beyond our own breathing. Sometimes there was a sound, a faint rustle in the undergrowth, a branch snapping in the distance, a low, guttural noise that made the hair on my arms stand up. Each time we froze, weapons raised, hearts pounding. Each time the sound faded, swallowed by the mist. The psychological toll was immediate and relentless. The bravado that had carried us into the woods was gone, replaced by a growing sense of vulnerability. Donnelly, usually unflappable, was tense, his eyes scanning the trees with a wariness I'd never seen before. Ramirez, the Joker, had gone silent, his face set and grim. Callahan, the officer, clung to the map like it was a lifeline, even though we all knew it was useless. Porter was on the edge of panic, his breathing quick and shallow. Carter was the only one who seemed calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his rifle a little too tightly. We pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. The forest closed in tighter, the mist swirling around us, the silence growing heavier with every step. It felt like we were walking through a dream, a nightmare where the rules of reality no longer applied. And then, just when I thought the tension couldn't get any worse, we heard it. A sound, low and deep, not quite a growl, not quite a groan, something in between. It resonated through the trees, vibrating in my chest like the bass from a distant explosion. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to freeze us in our tracks. We looked at each other, eyes wide, every muscle tensed for flight. "What the hell was that?" Porter whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. No one answered. The sound came again, closer this time, off to our right, maybe 50 yards into the trees. Then silence. Then, from our left, the same sound, the same distance. It was as if something or several somethings were moving around us, circling, communicating. "There's two of them," Carter said, his voice flat and steady. "Or it's moving fast. Too fast." Donnelly raised his fist, signaling us to halt. We formed a defensive circle, backs to each other, rifles trained outward. The mist swirled around us, thick enough now that even with night vision, I couldn't see more than a few feet. My heart hammered in my chest, my finger hovering over the trigger. Every shadow looked like movement, every shape in the mist a potential threat. The radio crackled, not with static, but with a voice. Distorted, broken, barely recognizable. "Bravo 2, contact immediate, fall back." It was bass, or at least it sounded like bass. Callahan grabbed his handset, desperate for a connection. "Bass, this is Bravo 2. Say again your last." We did not copy. More static, then the voice again, clearer this time. "Not alone, something in the forest, abort mission, return to..." The transmission cut off with a sharp burst of noise that made us all flinch. We stood there frozen, the weight of the message settling over us. Not alone. Abort mission. Return to where? We had no bearings, no way to navigate, no idea which direction was back. The forest had swallowed us whole, and whatever was out there was closing in. That was when the tree snapped. Not a branch. A whole tree. The crack echoed through the forest like a gunshot, and we all spun toward the sound. Through the mist, maybe 30 yards away, I saw the silhouette of a massive fir tilting, then crashing down with a sound that shook the ground beneath our boots. No wind, no reason for it to fall. Just gone. Move, Donnelly barked, his voice sharp and urgent. New. Double time. We ran, not a tactical retreat, not a controlled withdrawal. We ran like prey, boots pounding the wet earth, gear rattling, breath coming in ragged gasps. The mist thickened, the trees blurred together, and I lost track of direction, of distance, of everything except the man in front of me and the sound of something massive moving through the forest behind us. Branches snapped. Heavy footfalls thudded against the ground. And that sound, that low, resonating call, followed us through the dark. We burst into a small clearing, collapsing against a fallen log, gasping for air. Donnelly did a head count. 5 of us, still alive, still together. But as I looked back into the mist, I saw them. 2 shapes, tall, impossibly tall, standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching. Not moving, just watching. And that's when I knew. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't something command had briefed us on. And it sure as hell wasn't something we were prepared to face. First contact. We huddled in that clearing, backs pressed against the rough bark of a fallen log, lungs burning from the sprint, every sense straining for any sign of what was out there. The mist hung thick and heavy, swirling in the weak green glow of our night vision goggles, making the world feel small and suffocating. For a moment, all I could hear was the ragged breathing of the men around me and the frantic pounding of my own heart. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. 2 shapes, impossibly tall, standing just at the edge of the clearing. They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They simply watched. Their silhouettes blurred by the pine, but unmistakably massive, 8 feet, maybe more. Shoulders broad, arms hanging low, their presence radiating a kind of silent authority that made every instinct in my body scream to run. No one spoke. No one dared. Even Donnelly, who'd always been the first to bark an order or crack a joke, was silent, his eyes locked on the figures in the mist. Porter was shaking, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. Carter had a hand on his shoulder, whispering something I couldn't hear, trying to keep him grounded. Ramirez's knuckles were white on his rifle, and Callahan, usually so rigid and by the book, looked like he was about to snap. Finally, Donnelly broke the silence. Did everyone see that? His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife. We all nodded. There was no point in pretending. Whatever we'd seen it together. Height estimate? Callahan asked, surprising me with how steady his voice sounded. 8 feet, Carter replied without hesitation. Maybe more. Hard to tell through the mist, but definitely taller than any man. Could have been trees, Ramirez offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Shadows playing tricks. I shook my head. Trees don't move. Those things were watching us. I saw the way they shifted when we ran. Callahan pulled out his map, though it was little more than a prop at this point. Without compass bearings, it was just a piece of paper. Still, he studied it, probably just to feel like he had some control. Base told us to abort. We need to get back. Which direction is back? Porter's voice cracked. We've been running blind. Could be anywhere. He was right. In our panic, we had lost all sense of direction. The mist had disoriented us completely. For all we knew, we'd been running in circles, deeper into the forest instead of out. Donnelly stood, slinging his rifle across his chest, and pulled out a small notebook. He'd been keeping track of our movements, noting landmarks, time intervals, direction changes, old habits from before GPS, when soldiers navigated by dead reckoning and terrain features. We came from southeast. Creek was flowing northwest. If we backtrack along this ravine and pick up the creek sound again, we can follow it downstream. That'll take us toward lower elevation. Eventually, we'll hit the logging road. It was the best plan we had, Carter agreed, and between the two of them, they had more wilderness experience than the rest of us combined. We formed up again, tighter this time, no more than an arm's length between each man. Donnelly took point with Carter beside him, both scanning the terrain. Ramirez and I flanked the middle. Callahan and Porter brought up the rear. We moved slowly, methodically, weapons up, fingers on triggers. Every few steps, we'd stop and listen. The forest was still too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just our boots on wet earth and the distant sound of water. "How long until dawn?" Porter whispered. I checked my watch. 4 hours, maybe 5. "We can make it," Donnelly said, though I wasn't sure if he was trying to convince us or himself. We pushed through a dense section of undergrowth, though. Ferns and devil's club thick enough that we had to use our hands to clear a path. The plants were wet, soaking our gloves, and the cold was starting to bite through our gear. October in the Cascades meant temperatures dropping fast after sunset, and the mist made everything worse. That's when we found the first marker, a tree maybe 30 feet tall, with bark stripped away in long vertical gouges. The wood underneath was pale and fresh, sap still bleeding from the wounds. The marks were high, higher than any of us could reach, even standing on each other's shoulders. And they were deep, carved with something strong enough to tear through bark and heartwood like it was paper. Carter examined them closely, running his gloved hand along the grooves. Territorial marking. Bears do this sometimes. But he trailed off. "But what?" Callahan presses. "These aren't claw marks. Wrong pattern. And no bear reaches this high." He looked up at the top of the gouges, easily 10 feet off the ground. Whatever made these was tall, and it wanted something to know this was its territory. "Then we're in its territory," Ramirez said flatly. We found 3 more marked trees in the next 100 yards. All the same pattern, all the same height, and they seemed to form a perimeter, a boundary we'd crossed without knowing it. The creek sound grew louder. We were close. Donnelly signaled us to move faster, but carefully. The ground sloped downward, roots crisscrossing the path like tripwires. Porter nearly went down twice, catching himself on trees at the last second, and then we heard it again. That sound, low, resonating, vibrating in our chests. But this time it was different. This time it sounded like a call. And from somewhere deeper in the forest, another sound answered it. "They're communicating," Buck Carter said, his face pale even in the green glow of night vision. "How many do you think there are?" I asked. "At least 2, maybe more." The creek appeared through the mist, rushing over rocks, the sound almost comforting in its normalcy. We reached the bank and stopped. The tracks were there again, fresh ones, multiple sets, some heading upstream, others down. They'd been here recently. Minutes, maybe. "Which way?" Porter asked, his voice tight. Donnelly studied the tracks, then pointed downstream. "That way, lower elevation, toward the road." We followed the creek, moving faster now. The water guided us, gave us purpose. But every few minutes, we'd hear that sound. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, always around us, always watching. Ramirez keyed his radio again, hoping for a miracle. Static, then a burst of that metallic scraping sound that made us all wince. He was about to give up when a voice broke through, clearer this time. "Bravo 2, this is Overwatch. We have your last known position. Air support inbound. ETA 30 minutes. Mark your position with infrared strobe and take cover. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Acknowledge." Ramirez grabbed the handset so fast he nearly dropped it. "Overwatch, this is Bravo 2. We copy. Moving to extract point. Be advised, we have multiple unknown contacts in the area, requesting immediate evacuation." "Negative, Bravo 2. Evac not possible in current conditions. Visibility 0. You need to get to the logging road. Coordinates follow." The radio crackled coordinates that Callahan frantically scribbled down. We still had no working GPS, but at least we had a destination. The logging road was roughly 2 miles southwest of our current position, 2 miles through forest occupied by something that could snap trees and mark territory 10 feet off the ground. 30 minutes, Donnelly said. "We can make 2 miles in 30 minutes if we push hard." What about them? Porter asked, gesturing vaguely at the forest around us. We avoid contact, move fast, stay quiet. If we see them, we don't engage unless we have no choice. Donnelly looked at each of us. Command said not to engage. That means they know what's out here. And if they're telling us not to fight it, that means fighting is a bad idea. That should have been reassuring. Command had a plan. Help was coming. But the fact that they specifically ordered us not to engage made my stomach twist. What the hell were we dealing with that the Army didn't want us shooting at? We moved faster now, pushing through the forest with purpose. The mist thinned slightly as we descended, visibility improving to maybe 20 feet. I could make out more details now. The twisted roots, the moss-covered logs, the way the trees seemed to lean inward like they were closing around us, but the sense of being watched never left. If anything, it grew stronger, more oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. And somewhere just beyond the edge of sight, I knew they were still there, watching, waiting, deciding. The encounter, the forest seemed to close in tighter with every step. The mist swirling around our boots, the trees crowding together as if to block our escape. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and that musky animal scent that had haunted us since the first tracks. Every instinct screamed that we were being herded, not just followed. The sense of being watched was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty, a pressure at the back of my skull that made my skin crawl. We moved as fast as we dared, the ground sloping downward, roots and rocks threatening to trip us at every turn. The creek was our only guide, its sound growing louder as we descended, but even that comfort was fading. The water's rush was now punctuated by other noises, branches snapping, heavy footfalls echoing through the trees, and that low resonant call that vibrated in our chests. It was a sound that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to carry meaning, intent, and warning. Suddenly, Carter froze, raising his fist. We all stopped, weapons up, eyes scanning the mist. He pointed ahead, and through the swirling fog I saw a movement. Not the quick dart of a deer or the cautious step of a bear, but something deliberate, upright, and massive. It stood just beyond the reach of our night vision, shifting its weight from foot to foot, watching us with an intelligence that was unmistakable. My heart hammered in my chest as I raised my rifle, sighting through the scope. The night vision amplified what little light there was, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. 8 feet tall, maybe more, shoulders broad enough to block out the trees behind it, arms long and thick, hanging almost to its knees, covered in dark, matted hair. The face was the worst part, not quite human, not quite ape, something in between. The eyes caught the faint light and glowed amber, reflecting back a gaze that was both curious and calculating. It didn't charge. It didn't roar. It just stood there, blocking our path, as if daring us to try and pass. The forest was silent except for the sound of our breathing and the distant rush of the creek. Every second stretched into eternity. "Back up," Donnelly whispered, his voice barely audible. "Slow. No sudden moves." We stepped backward, weapons trained on the creature. It watched us, head tilting slightly as if studying our reactions. And then from behind us, that sound again. The call, deeper and closer than before. We spun around and saw another one, identical in size and build, emerging from the mist. We were boxed in. "Form a circle," Callahan ordered, his voice finally cracking under the pressure. We pressed together, backs nearly touching, rifles pointing outward. Through the mist, I counted at least 3 shapes now, maybe 4. They'd surrounded us, herded us away from the creek, away from our escape route, into a small clearing hemmed in by dense undergrowth. "Why aren't they attacking?" Porter whispered, his voice shaking. "They're sizing us up," Carter said, his tone flat. "Predators do this. Figure out if prey is worth the risk." "We're not prey," Ramirez growled, but his hands were white-knuckled on his rifle. One of the creatures moved closer, not aggressive, just curious. It tilted its head, the amber eyes fixed on me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was intelligence there, not just animal cunning, but something deeper. It knew we were afraid, and maybe, just maybe, it was deciding whether to let us leave. Donnelly's voice was steady, but I could hear the strain. Infrared strobe, now. Callahan fumbled with his vest, pulling out the strobe and activating it. The device would be invisible to us, but would flash bright for any aircraft with the infrared capability. It was our beacon, our last hope. The creature watching me saw the movement. Its eyes tracked Callahan's hand, and then it made a sound. Not the low rumble from before, but a sharper grunt, a warning. The others responded, the circle tightening. They were closer now, close enough that I could smell them, that musky, rotten fur smell that had followed us all night. Donnelly's voice was barely more than a breath. On my mark, we move, southwest, fast and hard. Don't stop for anything. They'll chase us, Porter said, panic rising in his voice. Yes, they will, but we're faster over short distances. We get to the road, we have air support, we can make it. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I didn't have a better plan. Donnelly counted down. 3, 2, 1, and we broke formation, sprinting through the only gap in the circle. Behind us, the forest erupted. Trees cracked, branches snapped, heavy footfalls thundered against the ground. The creatures gave chase, and they were fast, faster than anything that size should be. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. Gear rattled, lungs burned, boots slipped on wet ground, branches whipped my face. Behind us, getting closer. That sound, the terrible resonating call that vibrated through the trees. Porter stumbled, Carter grabbed him, yanked him upright, kept him moving. We crashed through undergrowth, tore through thicket, leaped over fallen logs. The mist swirled around us, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and then the ground dropped away. We skidded down a steep embankment, sliding through mud and loose rocks, unable to stop. I hit the bottom hard, pain shooting through my shoulder. Ramirez landed beside me, cursing. Porter rolled past us, crashing into a tree. Above us, at the top of the embankment, the creatures appeared. 3 of them, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. They stood there looking down at us, not pursuing, just watching. Why aren't they following? Callahan gasped, struggling to his feet. Carter pointed ahead. Through the trees, barely visible, I saw it. Lights, the logging road. We'd made it. We were at the boundary of whatever territory they'd claimed. They don't want to leave the forest, Carter said. Roads too exposed, too open. The creatures watched us a moment longer. Then, one by one, they turned and disappeared back into the mist. We staggered to our feet, battered and exhausted, and stumbled toward the road. The moment we broke through the tree line, the change was immediate. The air felt lighter. The oppressive silence lifted, and in the distance I heard it. The thump of helicopter rotors. We collapsed on the gravel road, chests heaving, hands shaking. The helicopter appeared minutes later, searchlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating us in brilliant white light. As they pulled us aboard, I looked back at the forest. The mist still clung to the trees, thick and impenetrable. And somewhere in that darkness, I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. We'd made it out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the real story was just beginning. Whatever those things were, they'd let us go, but not because they were afraid, because they wanted us to remember the escape and aftermath. The helicopter's searchlight cut through the mist like a blade, blinding after so many hours in the green-black world of night vision. We stumbled out of the trees and onto the gravel road, battered, soaked, and shaking. The rotors thundered overhead, the downwash scattering the last wisps of fog and flattening the grass around us. For a moment, the world felt real again, solid, loud, and bright. But the relief was thin, fragile, and already slipping away. We collapsed where we stood, boots scraping on the loose stones, chests heaving as we tried to catch our breath. The crew chief shouted orders, but his words barely registered. I remember hands grabbing my vest, pulling me toward the open door, the heat of the engine washing over my frozen skin. Someone threw a thermal blanket over my shoulders, but the cold inside me wouldn't budge. It was a different kind of cold. The kind that settles in your bones when you realize the world isn't what you thought it was. Inside the helicopter, the noise was deafening. The others slumped into their seats, eyes wide and unfocused. Porter stared at his hands, still shaking even under the blanket. Carter gazed out the open door, jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break his teeth. Ramirez had his eyes closed, lips moving in a silent prayer, or maybe just counting the seconds until we were safe. Callahan sat rigid, arms crossed, face unreadable. Donnelly just stared at the floor, lost in whatever thoughts soldiers carry when things go sideways. The crew chief tried to hand us water. We took it, but no one drank. He asked if anyone needed medical attention. We shook our heads. What were we supposed to say? That we were fine? That we'd just been hunted through the forest by something that shouldn't exist? The words wouldn't come. The truth was too big, too raw, and too dangerous to speak out loud. The flight back to base was a blur. The world below was a patchwork of darkness and scattered lights, the forest stretching out in every direction, endless and impenetrable. I watched the mist cling to the treetops, thick and stubborn, and wondered if the creatures were still down there watching us leave, marking the boundary between their world and ours. When we landed, the reception was nothing like I expected. No cheers, no relief, just a line of men in unfamiliar uniforms waiting on the tarmac. They wore no unit patches, just name tags and rank insignia, their faces unreadable in the harsh floodlights. At the center of the group stood a man in civilian clothes, mid-40s, graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light. He introduced himself as Dr. Richard Vance, and his voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. "Gentlemen," he said as we climbed out, "I'll be conducting your debrief. Please follow me." It wasn't a request. We were led not to our barracks, not to the command building, but to a structure on the far side of the base we'd never been inside. No windows, heavy security door, the kind of place that made you feel like you were already guilty of something. Inside, it looked more like a research facility than a military building. White walls, fluorescent lights, the sharp smell of disinfectant. They separated us, each into different rooms. I found myself in a space no bigger than an interrogation cell, sitting at a metal table across from Dr. Vance and a younger man he introduced as Dr. Kemp. A recording device sat between us, its red light blinking steadily. "Before we begin," Vance said, sliding a document across the table, "you'll need to sign this." I picked it up, non-disclosure agreement, dense legal language, but the message was clear. I would not speak about what happened to anyone, ever, under penalty of court-martial and federal prosecution. "What if I don't sign on, ma'am?" I asked. Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'll spend the next 72 hours in isolation while we determine if you're experiencing combat stress, hallucinations, or other psychological breaks that require extended observation and treatment. Your family will be notified that you've had a mental health crisis." The threat was clear: sign or be branded unstable. I signed. "Good," Vance said, collecting the paper. "Now tell me everything that happened from the moment you lost radio contact." I did. Every detail I could remember: the spinning compasses, the tracks, the marked trees, the creatures, the chase. I expected him to look skeptical, to suggest I'd imagined it, to tell me it was the shadows and fear. But he didn't. He just nodded, made notes, asked clarifying questions. "Height estimate on the entities?" he asked. 8 feet, maybe taller. Build was broad, muscular. Arms longer than proportional to body. Eye coloration? Amber, reflective in low light. Did they vocalize? Yes, deep, resonating sound, almost like a call. And they answered each other. Coordinated behavior, definitely. They boxed us in, herded us away from the creek. Vance exchanged a glance with Kemp. Something passed between them, unspoken but understood. "What did you see?" I asked. "You're not surprised. You already knew they were there." Vance set down his pen. "What I know and what I'm authorized to tell you are different things. But I can say this: you are not the first group to encounter anomalous entities in that region. And you won't be the last." "Anomalous entities," I repeated. "You mean Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever the hell those things were?" "I mean unidentified bipedal hominids that exhibit characteristics inconsistent with known primate species," Vance said carefully. "We've documented encounters going back decades. Most are inconclusive: tracks, sounds, brief sightings. What happened to your unit tonight is significant. Significant how? You engaged with multiple entities simultaneously. You observed coordinated behavior, territorial marking, and communication. That's more data than we've gathered in 20 years. He leaned forward. Tell me, did you feel at any point that they were trying to kill you? I thought about it. The chase, the way they'd surrounded us, the sheer power they'd displayed. No, if they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. They were warning us off, pushing us out of their territory. Exactly. Vance made another note, which suggests intelligence, restraint, and understanding of boundaries. So what now, I asked. You've got your data. What happens to us? You return to your unit, you complete your service, and you never speak of this again. The official report will state that your team experienced equipment, failure, and disorientation in adverse weather conditions. You were successfully extracted. No anomalies occurred. And the truth? The truth is classified for reasons you are not cleared to understand. He stood, signaling the interview was over, but I wasn't done. Why do you keep sending people in there? I asked. If you know what's in those mountains, why keep running exercises in that area? Vance paused at the door. Because we need to understand them, their range, their behavior, their numbers. And the only way to do that is controlled exposure. Your unit wasn't sent there by accident. You were sent there because we knew there was a possibility of contact. We were bait, I said flatly. You were researchers, Vance corrected, whether you knew it or not. And the data you've provided tonight is invaluable. He left, the door locking behind him. I sat alone in that white room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and tried to process what I'd just been told. We'd been used, sent into the forest not for training, but as part of some long-running study of creatures the government refused to acknowledge existed. An hour later, maybe more, they let us out. We gathered in a waiting area, the five of us. We looked at each other, and I could see the same realization in every face. We'd all been told the same thing: sign the papers, keep quiet, pretend it didn't happen. This was the new reality: the forest, the creatures, the cover-up, and the knowledge that we'd been part of something much bigger and much darker than any of us had ever imagined. The cover-up and lingering questions. We were released back to our barracks just before dawn, the sky outside still a deep bruised blue. The rest of the base was waking up, soldiers moving through their morning routines, oblivious to what had happened just a few miles away in the forest. To them, it was just another day. For us, everything had changed. We moved through the motions, stowing gear, cleaning weapons, reporting for roll call, but there was a heaviness between us, a silent agreement that what we'd seen, what we'd survived, would never be spoken of again. The non-disclosure agreements we'd signed felt like shackles. The threat was clear: break your silence, and your life as you know it is over. Dishonorable discharge, ruined reputation, maybe even jail time. But the real punishment was the isolation. We couldn't talk to anyone, not our families, not our friends, not even each other. Not really. The experience had marked us, set us apart, and the more we tried to act normal, the more obvious it became that we weren't. Porter was the first to crack. Within a week, he requested a transfer, anywhere but here, anywhere far from the mountains. They granted it without question, shipping him off to a base in Texas, a place where the only thing lurking in the woods was the occasional rattlesnake. Carter finished his service and went home to Montana, but I heard later he never went hunting again. Couldn't bring himself to walk into the woods, not after what he'd seen. Callahan stayed in the Army, climbing the ranks, but he never mentioned that night again. Last I heard, he was a colonel stationed overseas. Ramirez and I kept in touch for a while, but eventually we drifted apart. The weight of what we carried was too much to share, even between us. And Donnelly put in his retirement papers 2 months later, 20 years of service, and he walked away. I ran into Donnelly once, years later, at a veterans event. We recognized each other across the room, and for a moment I thought about going over, about finally talking about what happened. But he looked at me, shook his head slightly, and turned away. The message was clear. Some things are better left buried. I stayed in for another 6 years before getting out. took a job as a contractor, spent time in places where the threats were human and the rules of engagement made sense. But I never forgot that night, never stopped wondering what was really happening in those mountains. Over the years, I started to notice a pattern, stories from other soldiers, other bases, other encounters. Always vague, always classified, always buried under layers of denial and paperwork. It was like a shadow network, a web of secrets stretching across the country. Remote training areas, unexplained equipment failures, teams going silent and then suddenly extracted. Official reports that read like cover-ups. How many times had it happened? How many soldiers had been sent into those mountains, those forests, those valleys, not knowing they were part of an experiment? The more I dug, the more I realized our experience wasn't unique. I found references to something called Ursus Protocol buried in declassified documents from the 1960s. The files were heavily redacted, but the gist was clear. The Department of Defense, in cooperation with the Forest Service and other agencies, had been monitoring and documenting reports of unknown bipedal hominids for decades. The stated purpose was threat assessment, understanding whether these entities posed a risk to national security, to civilian populations, to military operations in wilderness areas. But the real purpose, reading between the lines, was something else. They wanted to know if these creatures could be controlled, studied, used. I found job postings for wildlife biologists and terrain specialists with security clearances that made no sense for civilian positions. I found procurement records for specialized tracking equipment, infrared cameras, audio recording systems, all deployed to remote forest locations with no public explanation. And I found casualty reports, not many and never official, but buried in veterans forums and support groups. Soldiers telling stories, training exercises gone wrong, encounters with aggressive wildlife, teams extracted under mysterious circumstances, always with the same pattern. Sign the papers, keep quiet, move on. I reached out to Ramirez. It took me months to find him. He'd gone off-grid, living in a small town in Arizona, working construction. When I finally got him on the phone, he was quiet for a long time. "Why are you digging into this?" he finally asked. "Because I need to know if what happened to us was an isolated incident or part of something bigger." "It's bigger," he said flatly. "Way bigger. And the more you dig, the more dangerous it gets for you. I was looking into it too for a while. Then I stopped. You know why? Because people who ask too many questions about this stuff and have a way of disappearing. Not into the woods, into the system. Psychiatric holds, discredited, made to look unstable. Has anyone approached you?" 3 months after we got out, a man showed up at my house. Civilian clothes, government ID, said he was with a research program studying post-traumatic stress in soldiers who'd experienced unusual wildlife encounters. Wanted to know if I'd be willing to participate in a study. Paid, of course. I told him no, and he smiled, said that was fine. Then told me he hoped I was adjusting well to civilian life and that sometimes the best way to process trauma was to let it go, not talk about it, not think about it, just let it go. Ramirez's voice went cold. It was a threat. They wanted to make sure I stayed quiet. Did they ever come back? No, because I took the hint. And you should too. Whatever you're trying to find, it's not worth your life. But I couldn't stop. The more I learned, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about a few isolated incidents. This was a systematic long-term operation to monitor and document an entire species that officially didn't exist. And the scariest part? They were getting more aggressive with their research. I've found references to live capture attempts in heavily redacted military reports. Equipment requisitions for tranquilizer systems powerful enough to drop large primates, construction contracts for secure holding facilities in remote locations described only as wildlife research stations. They weren't just studying these creatures anymore. They were trying to capture them. I thought about that night in the Cascades, the intelligence I'd seen in those amber eyes, the restraint they'd shown. They could have killed us, but they chose not to. What would happen when that restraint ran out? When they realized humans weren't just passing through their territory anymore, but actively hunting them? I tried to reach Carter, but his number was disconnected. I called his last known address in Montana, but the person who answered said he'd moved away years ago. No forwarding information. Porter had vanished into the military bureaucracy, transferred so many times I lost the trail. Donnelly was dead. I found his obituary from 2027. Heart attack, it said, but he was only 62, healthy, active. I wondered if it was really his heart that gave out, or if someone decided he knew too much. That left Callahan. Colonel Callahan now, stationed at the Pentagon, I managed to get a message to him through official channels. Just a simple request to speak, citing our shared service. He called me back within an hour. I was wondering when you'd reach out, he said. No pleasantries, no small talk. You've been asking questions, making people nervous. I just want to know the truth. The truth is classified. You signed papers agreeing to that. Those papers were signed under duress, and you know it. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, tired. What do you want from me? I want to know what happened to us wasn't an accident. I want to know we were sent there deliberately, and I want to know what they're planning to do with all the data they've collected. Yes, you were sent there deliberately. Your unit was selected because of your experience, your reliability, and your security clearances. You were meant to make contact, observe, and report. That was the mission you weren't briefed on, he said. As for what they're planning, I don't know. I'm not read into that part of the operation. But I can tell you this, there are people at levels above me who believe these entities represent both a threat and an opportunity. And when people in power see opportunity, they exploit it. Even if it means violating every ethical boundary we have, especially then, because to them, these aren't people. They're not protected by law, by rights, by international conventions. They're anomalies, unknown biological assets, property of whoever can claim them first. The words hit me like a punch. They're going to weaponize them. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Another long silence, then, stop digging. For your own sake. You've served your country. You've done your part. Let someone else carry this burden. I can't. Then you're a fool, and you'll end up like the others who couldn't let it go. He hung up. I sat there, phone in my hand, and realized I'd reached the end of the line. Every path I'd followed led to the same place. Classified programs, disappeared people, and a government apparatus designed to keep the truth buried. But I'd learned enough to know that what happened to us in the Cascades was just one small piece of a much larger picture. Enough to know that somewhere in the wilderness of North America, maybe in dozens of locations, a species that had avoided human contact for thousands of years was being systematically hunted, documented, and targeted for purposes I could only guess at. And enough to know that one day, maybe soon, the precarious balance between their world and ours would shatter. When that happened, when the truth finally came out, whether through a leak, a whistleblower, or an incident too big to cover up, the world would have to answer for what we'd done in the name of national security. I just hoped, when that day came, we were ready for the consequences. The bigger picture. After that final call with Callahan, I realized the story wasn't just about what happened to us in the Cascades. It was about something much larger, something that stretched across decades, across states, across the invisible boundaries between what the public is allowed to know and what's buried in classified files. The more I tried to return to a normal life, the more I saw the pattern repeating itself, hidden in plain sight for anyone who knew where to look. I took a job as a contractor, working risk assessment for construction projects in remote areas. It was supposed to be a way to keep moving, to stay distracted, but it only put me closer to the places most people avoided. Deep wilderness, old-growth forests, valleys where the mist never seemed to lift. And everywhere I went, I started to notice the same signs. Equipment failures, missing persons, stories whispered by locals about things that moved in the night. 3 years after that night in the Cascades, I found myself on a job site in northern Idaho near the Cascade Mountains. The construction company wanted to put in a logging road, and my job was to assess terrain stability and environmental risks. Standard stuff. But when I met with the local Forest Service liaison, an older guy named Bill Hicks, I realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. "You military?" he asked, eyeing the way I carried myself. Thought so. You've got that look. Seen some things?" He paused, studying me. "You ever work in Washington? Cascade Range?" I kept my face neutral. "Why do you ask?" "Because you've got the same look as the last guy who came through here with contractor credentials. Military background, asking questions about terrain, wildlife patterns, unusual animal activity. Said he was doing environmental assessment, but he spent most of his time asking about the old logging roads, the ones that got closed down in the 90s, the ones that lead into territories where crews stopped working because too many people went missing." "People go missing in the wilderness all the time," I said carefully. "Sure they do, but not experienced loggers, not entire crews who know these mountains better than their own backyards." He pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk. "This is off the record. Company doesn't know I have this. Government doesn't know I kept copies." Inside were incident reports. Dozens of them, dating back to the 1970s. Loggers reporting equipment vandalized, massive trees pushed over, strange vocalizations at night, search and rescue operations for missing workers that turned up nothing. No bodies, no blood, just abandoned gear and enormous footprints. The reports always described as bear tracks, unusual size. "How many?" I asked. 17 confirmed disappearances in this region alone over 40 years. Probably more that weren't reported. Families who just accepted that the mountains claimed their loved ones. He tapped the folder. And every time, the Forest Service would close the area temporarily, cite safety concerns, then quietly reopen it a few months later. No explanations, no follow-up, just move along, nothing to see here. I thought about what Dr. Vance had told me. Controlled exposure. Data collection. You think the government knows? I think the government has always known. And I think people like you, people like that last contractor, you're all part of something bigger, something they're not telling us." He leaned forward. "So I'm going to ask you straight. What the hell is in these mountains?" I should have stonewalled, should have played dumb, cited my NDA, walked away. But Hicks had lost friends to these mountains. He deserved something. "I can't tell you what I saw," I said slowly, "but I can tell you this. If the Forest Service closes an area and tells you it's for safety, believe them. And if you ever find yourself in the deep wilderness and things start feeling wrong, compasses spinning, radios dead, silence in the trees, don't investigate. Leave. Fast." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. That's what I thought. After that meeting, I couldn't let it go. I started digging, carefully, using contacts I'd made during my service, calling in favors, piecing together fragments. What I found was a network of incidents stretching across the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, the Appalachian Mountains. Anywhere with deep, old-growth forest and rugged terrain, the reports were always similar. Equipment failure, unexplained disappearances, strange sounds, massive tracks, and always government agencies showing up. Conducting investigations that went nowhere, filing reports that classified everything as natural causes or wildlife encounters or human error. But beneath the official explanations, there was a pattern, a project. I found references to something called Ursus Protocol buried in declassified documents from the 1960s. The files were heavily redacted, but the gist was clear. The Department of Defense, in cooperation with the Forest Service and other agencies, had been monitoring and documenting reports of unknown bipedal hominids for decades. The stated purpose was threat assessment, understanding whether these entities posed a risk to national security, to civilian populations, and to military operations in wilderness areas. But the real purpose, reading between the lines, was something else. They wanted to know if these creatures could be controlled, studied, used. I found job postings for wildlife biologists and terrain specialists with security clearances that made no sense for civilian positions. I found procurement records for specialized tracking equipment, infrared cameras, audio recording systems. all deployed to remote forest locations with no public explanation. And I found casualty reports, not many and never official, but buried in veterans forums and support groups. Soldiers telling stories, training exercises gone wrong, encounters with aggressive wildlife, teams extracted under mysterious circumstances, always with the same pattern. Sign the papers. Keep quiet. Move on. I reached out to Ramirez. It took me months to find him. He'd gone off-grid, living in a small town in Arizona, working construction. When I finally got him on the phone, he was quiet for a long time. "Why are you digging into this?" he finally asked. "Because I need to know if what happened to us was an isolated incident or part of something bigger." "It's bigger," he said flatly. "Way bigger. And the more you dig, the more dangerous it gets for you." I was looking into it too for a while. Then I stopped. You know why? Because people who ask too many questions about this stuff have a way of disappearing. Not into the woods, into the system. Psychiatric holds, discredited, made to look unstable. Has anyone approached you? 3 months after we got out, a man showed up at my house. Civilian clothes, government ID, said he was with a research program studying post-traumatic stress in soldiers who'd experienced unusual wildlife encounters. Wanted to know if I'd be willing to participate in a study, paid, of course. I told him no, and he smiled, said that was fine. Then told me he hoped I was adjusting well to civilian life and that sometimes the best way to process trauma was to let it go. Not talk about it, not think about it, just let it go. Ramirez's voice went cold. It was a threat. They wanted to make sure I stayed quiet. Did they ever come back? No, because I took the hint, and you should too. Whatever you're trying to find, it's not worth your life. But I couldn't stop. The more I learned, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about a few isolated incidents. This was a systematic, long-term operation to monitor and document an entire species that officially didn't exist. And the scariest part? They were getting more aggressive with their research. I found references to live capture attempts in heavily redacted military reports, equipment requisitions for tranquilizer systems powerful enough to drop large primates, construction contracts for secure holding facilities in remote locations described only as wildlife research stations. They weren't just studying these creatures anymore. They were trying to capture them. I thought about that night in the Cascades, the intelligence I'd seen in those amber eyes, the restraint they'd shown. They could have killed us, but they chose not to. What would happen when that restraint ran out? When they realized humans weren't just passing through their territory anymore, but actively hunting them? I tried to reach Carter, but his number was disconnected. I called his last known address in Montana, but the person who answered said he'd moved away years ago. No forwarding information. Porter had vanished into the military bureaucracy, transferred so many times I lost the trail. Donnelly was dead. I found his obituary from 2027. Heart attack, it said. But he was only 62, healthy, active. I wondered if it was really his heart that gave out, or if someone decided he knew too much. That left Callahan. Colonel Callahan now, stationed at the Pentagon. I managed to get a message to him through official channels. Just a simple request to speak, citing our shared service. He called me back within an hour. "I was wondering when you'd reach out," he said. "No pleasantries, no small talk. You've been asking questions, making people nervous. I just want to know the truth. The truth is classified. You signed the papers agreeing to that. Those papers were signed under duress, and you know it." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, tired. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know what happened to us wasn't an accident. I want to know we were sent there deliberately, and I want to know what they're planning to do with all the data they've collected." "Yes, you were sent there deliberately. Your unit was selected because of your experience, your reliability, and your security clearances. You were meant to make contact, observe, and report. That was the mission you weren't briefed on," he sighed. "As for what they're planning, I don't know. I'm not read into that part of the operation. But I can tell you this, there are people at levels above me who believe these entities represent both a threat and an opportunity. And when people in power see opportunity, they exploit it, even if it means violating every ethical boundary we have, especially then, because to them, these aren't people. They're not protected by law, by rights, by international conventions. They're anomalies. Unknown biological assets, property of whoever can claim them first. The words hit me like a punch. They're going to weaponize them. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Another long silence then. Stop digging, for your own sake. You've served your country. You've done your part. Let someone else carry this burden. I can't. Then you're a fool, and you'll end up like the others who couldn't let it go. He hung up. I sat there, phone in my hand, and realized I'd reached the end of the line. Every path I'd followed led to the same place. Classified programs, disappeared people, and a government apparatus designed to keep the truth buried. But I'd learned enough. Enough to know that what happened to us in the Cascades was just one small piece of a much larger picture. Enough to know that somewhere in the wilderness of North America, maybe in dozens of locations, a species that had avoided human contact for thousands of years was being systematically hunted, documented, and targeted for purposes I could only guess at. And enough to know that one day, maybe soon, the precarious balance between their world and ours would shatter. When that happened, when the truth finally came out, whether through a leak, a whistleblower, or an incident too big to cover up, the world would have to answer for what we'd done in the name of national security. I just hoped, when that day came, we were ready for the consequences. The moral dilemma and final warning. 15 years have passed since that night in the Cascade Mountains, but the weight of what happened has never left me. It's a burden I carry in silence, a secret that's shaped every decision I've made since. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if I should have spoken out sooner, if I should have risked everything to tell the world what I saw. But every time I get close, I remember the threats, the NDAs, the way people who ask too many questions simply vanish. Not just from the public eye, but from the record itself. Their credibility destroyed, their reputation shredded, their stories dismissed as the ramblings of unstable veterans or conspiracy theorists. And yet, the question haunts me. What moral obligation do we have to the creatures that exist in the shadows of our world? Creatures that have avoided us, lived alongside us in secret, asked nothing but to be left alone. Some would argue they're dangerous, that the military has an obligation to monitor potential threats. And yes, they're powerful. Yes, they could kill if threatened. But in every documented encounter I found, aggression only occurred when humans pushed into their territory, when we threatened them first. They're not monsters, they're survivors, a species that's learned to exist in the margins in the places we haven't yet destroyed with development and industry. And now, because we've discovered them, because we've documented them, we've decided we have the right to control them. It's the same pattern humans have followed for millennia. Find something we don't understand, study it, classify it, exploit it, and when it resists, destroy it. I think about those creatures in the Cascade Mountains often. Do they remember us? The soldiers who stumbled into their territory that night? Do they tell their young about the strange bipeds with artificial lights and loud weapons who ran through the forest in panic? Or have they moved on, finding deeper wilderness, more remote valleys where human presence hasn't yet reached? I hope so. I hope they're smart enough to stay hidden, to keep moving, to avoid the tracking teams I know are still out there, but I also know the wilderness is shrinking. Development pushes further into remote areas every year. Climate change disrupts habitats. The places where they can hide are becoming fewer and farther between. And when there's nowhere left to retreat to, what happens then? That's what keeps me up at night. Not the memory of being chased through the forest, not the fear I felt facing something stronger and larger than myself, but the knowledge that we're forcing a confrontation, that our inability to coexist with anything we don't control will eventually lead to conflict we could have avoided. I've thought about going public many times, writing a book, doing interviews, breaking my NDA and accepting the consequences. But every time I get close, I think about what Ramirez said. People who ask too many questions disappear, not just physically. Their credibility vanishes. They become jokes, cautionary tales, unstable veterans clinging to PTSD-induced fantasies. And even if people believed me, what would change? Would the government admit to decades of secret operations? Would they shut down the URSS protocol and leave these creatures in peace? Or would public knowledge just accelerate their plans, push them to act before international pressure could stop them? Sometimes ignorance is safer for them, if not for us. But I can't stay completely silent either. So I do what I can. I share information with the right people. I warn soldiers who might be sent on similar training exercises to watch for the signs: malfunctioning equipment, unnatural silence, tracks that don't match known animals. I tell them that if they encounter something they can't explain, the smart move is to leave, not engage. I've made contact with others like me, people who've had encounters, who've been forced to sign NDAs, who carry the same burden. We don't organize, we don't meet in person, but we share information carefully, watching each other's backs, making sure that if one of us disappears, others will know it wasn't an accident. It's a strange kind of resistance, quiet, hidden, probably ineffective in the grand scheme of things, but it's something. It's refusing to let the truth die completely. Porter reached out to me last year, took me by surprise. He'd found my contact information through a mutual friend, took a risk sending that first encrypted email. We talked for hours, two men who'd been through something impossible, trying to make sense of it across a video call. "Do you regret it?" he asked. That night, signing the papers, staying quiet. I thought about it for a long time. I regret that we were used, that we were sent in there without being told the truth. But the encounter itself? No, because now I know, and I can't be lied to about what's possible anymore. You think they'll ever go public with it? Only if they have to. If something goes wrong and they can't contain it, or if they've already achieved their objectives and there's no reason to hide anymore. I paused. Neither scenario ends well for those creatures. Then what do? We remember, we document, and we hope that when the truth comes out, there are enough people like us who will stand up and say these beings have a right to exist without being hunted, studied, or weaponized. It's not much, but it's all we have. I still work as a contractor, still spend time in remote areas, and yes, I still look for signs, not to document them for any government program, but to know they're still out there, that they're surviving despite everything we've done. Sometimes I find tracks. Sometimes I hear sounds in the distance that make my heart race the way it did that night 15 years ago. And sometimes in the deep forest, where human presence is rare, I feel watched, not threatened, just observed. I like to think they remember too, that somewhere in their collective knowledge passed down through generations. There's a story about the night humans stumbled into their valley and then ran away. A reminder that we're dangerous, yes, but also weak, confused, lost in the wilderness we pretend to own. Maybe that knowledge will help them survive, help them stay hidden long enough that by the time we're ready to coexist peacefully, there are still some left to coexist with. Or maybe I'm being naive. Maybe the trajectory is set and all I'm doing is delaying the inevitable. Maybe the government will eventually capture one, dissect it, study it, and then hunt down the rest to prevent any inconvenient questions about what we've lost. But I refuse to believe that's the only possible future. I have to believe that humanity is capable of more than domination and exploitation, that we can learn to share the planet with other intelligent species, even if they're not human. Call it hope, call it delusion, but it's what keeps me going. So why am I telling you this now? Why risk everything to share this story? Because silence is complicity, and I've been complicit long enough. If you're reading this, if you're listening to this story, I have one request. Don't dismiss it as fantasy. Don't file it away as just another Bigfoot tale told by someone looking for attention. The creatures in those mountains are real. The government programs studying them are real. And the moral questions about how we treat other intelligent species are real. What you do with that information is up to you, but at least now you know. The way I wish I'd known before they sent us into the Cascade Mountains, that October night in 2019. The way I wish every soldier knew before they're sent on a training exercise in remote wilderness with equipment that mysteriously malfunctions in orders that don't quite make sense. Watch for the signs. Question the mission. And if you find yourself surrounded by fog in a forest gone silent, with compasses spinning and something large moving just beyond your sight, remember this. You're not the first. You won't be the last. But you can choose what you do with what you witness. You can sign the papers and bury the truth. Or you can remember, document, and when the time is right, speak. I've made my choice. Now you have to make yours. Conclusion. Call to action. If you've made it this far, you know more than most ever will. You know the truth that's been hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, redacted reports, and the silence of those who were forced to carry the burden. You know that the wilderness is not empty, that the shadows between the trees are not always just shadows, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the forest isn't what's hunting you, it's what you bring with you. Fear, arrogance, the belief that everything unknown must be conquered or explained. I left the military in 2025, my discharge papers stamped and my head full of memories I couldn't share with anyone. I tried civilian life, worked security for a while, then took a job with a private contractor doing risk assessment for construction projects in remote areas. The work kept me moving, kept me distracted, but it also put me in places most people avoided, deep wilderness, areas marked on maps but rarely visited. And that's when I started noticing the patterns. The same stories, the same warnings, the same disappearances, the same silence from those who should have been asking questions. Over the years, I've met others like me. Some are veterans, some are loggers, rangers, or even hikers who stumbled into something they couldn't explain. We don't form clubs or secret societies. We don't meet in person, but we share information, quietly, carefully, always watching our backs. We know that the system is designed to protect itself, that the truth is a threat to those who profit from secrets. But we also know that silence is a choice, and every time we choose it, we make it easier for the next person to disappear without a trace. I've spent countless nights replaying that night in the Cascades, wondering what would have happened if we'd made different choices. If we'd ignored the warnings, if we'd tried to fight, if we'd refused to sign those papers. Would it have changed anything? Or would the machine have simply rolled on, grinding up anyone who got in its way? Sometimes I think about the creatures themselves, what they must think of us. With our weapons and our fear, our endless need to control and classify. I wonder if they tell stories about us, the way we tell stories about them. I hope, in some small way, that our encounter taught them something about mercy, about restraint, about the possibility of coexistence. But I'm not naive. I know that the world doesn't change just because one person decides to speak up. I know that the forces at work here are bigger than any one of us. But I also know that every story matters. Every warning, every piece of evidence, every voice that refuses to be silenced adds weight to the truth. And sometimes that's enough to tip the balance. So here's my request to you, the person on the other side of this screen. Don't let this story die in the comments section. Don't let it become just another piece of internet folklore, another creepypasta to be shared and forgotten. If you've ever experienced something in the wilderness you couldn't explain, if you've ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand up for no reason, or heard a sound that didn't belong, or found tracks that didn't match any animal you know, share your story, not for clicks or likes, but because every story is a thread in a tapestry that's bigger than any one of us. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're from, what time you're watching, and if you've ever had an encounter that made you question what's really out there. Your story matters. It might be the missing piece that helps someone else make sense of their own experience. It might be the warning that keeps someone safe. Or it might just be the first step in a conversation that's long overdue. And if you're one of the skeptics, if you think this is all just a story, a bit of entertainment for a slow night, ask yourself why so many people from so many walks of life keep telling the same kinds of stories. Why the government spends so much time and money making sure those stories never see the light of day. Why the people who know the most are always the ones who say the least. I'm not asking you to believe everything I've said. I'm asking you to remember it, to keep your eyes open the next time you find yourself in the deep woods or the mountains or anywhere the map starts to blur and the silence grows heavy. Remember that some boundaries exist for a reason. Remember that not everything in this world is meant to be discovered, classified, or controlled. Some things are meant to be respected, left alone, given the space to exist on their own terms. The forest remembers. The mountains remember. And those of us who walked through that valley 15 years ago, we remember too. We carry the weight of what we saw, the burden of what we were forced to hide, and the hope, however fragile, that the truth will matter when it finally comes to light. If you're watching this, if you've made it this far, I'll leave you with the same words I wish someone had told me before that night. The wilderness is not empty. It never has been. And the things that live in the shadows have just as much right to exist as we do. Remember that. Remember us. And when the day comes that you have to choose between silence and truth, I hope you're braver than I was. I hope you speak sooner before it's too late. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment telling us your story. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, some boundaries exist for a reason.